This photo was taken around 4 p.m. on a Saturday in September 1875, somewhere between Manchester and Liverpool. It shows 37 people posing in front of the camera. Some stood on wooden poles several feet off the ground. Others stood in perfect rows, all wearing their performance outfits. There were acrobats, strong men, contortionist women, little people, extremely tall individuals, and children with painted faces. Behind them stood a large circus tent, towering under a gloomy English sky. At first glance, it looks like a typical group photo of a traveling circus troupe. But what's not visible is a chilling fact that just 6 hours after this picture was taken, every person in it would be dead. All of them. What happened that night is still one of the strangest and least understood tragedies of Victorian times. The group was called Godfrey's Grand Menagerie and Curiosity Show, a bold mix of classic circus acts and so-called human curiosities, a common feature of that era's freak shows. The man behind it, Silas Godfrey, wasn't just another shady fairground promoter. He had spent 15 years building a name for himself while touring across England, Scotland, and Wales. He knew exactly what the public wanted, jaw-dropping acts and sights that challenged their sense of reality. The troupe had about 40 members, though that number changed often with temporary hires. The main act was a family of 6 Polish siblings known for pulling off high-risk acrobatic stunts. There were also 3 very tall men, likely suffering from gigantism, who stood between 7 feet 2 inches and nearly 8 feet tall. 2 conjoined twins, sold to the troupe as children by their Irish parents, were part of the lineup too. Another performer, Constance Fairchild, was known as the Elastic Woman. She could twist her body in ways most people couldn't. Today, she might be diagnosed with a condition like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, but such terms didn't exist back then. And then there were the kids. Victorian-era freak shows always included children. Some were born into the troupe. Others were brought in through a variety of means, bought, taken in, or even allegedly stolen. In the photo, at least 6 children are clearly visible, aged somewhere between 5 and 12. Their faces look blank and serious. No smiles, no squirming, just a quiet stillness that comes from being trained to perform and be watched. That night's event wasn't out of the ordinary. It was just another stop on a tour that had already been running for 3 months. They had set up their tent on a rented field outside a small industrial town. Some sources say it was Wigan. Others claim it was Warrington. That confusion later made investigations harder. The tent itself was huge for its time, about 100 feet long and 65 feet wide, held up by a 50-foot central oak pole and a web of ropes and steel cables. Heavy iron stakes secured the sides. This wasn't a slapdash setup. Godfrey had spent a lot of money on quality gear because he knew his reputation depended on delivering both excitement and safety. The weather that day was unsettled. Records from the Royal Meteorological Society show that northwest England saw a lot of storms that September. Cold Atlantic air was mixing with warmer continental air, creating unstable conditions. Still, when the photo was taken, the sky was just cloudy, not stormy, and no rain or strong wind was recorded. The show was scheduled for 8 p.m. Tickets had been on sale for a week, advertised in local papers, and posted in public spaces like taverns. Prices depended on the seat. 3 pence for side benches, 6 pence for better views, and a full shilling for premium seats reserved for wealthier families. For reference, a typical factory worker earned about 15 to 20 shillings a week, so the show was a pricey but doable treat, based on ticket sales and later reports. It's believed around 250 to 300 people came that night. Entire families, groups of young workers, and a few middle-class folks looking for fun filled the tent. Before the show, vendors wandered around selling roasted chestnuts, light beer, and candy. Kids played between the rows of seats. Adults smoked pipes. It felt like a normal night out. But no one knew that one of the main support points of the tent had a serious problem. Later investigations found a hidden crack in the central mast, about 10 feet up from the base. Moisture had likely seeped in over time, slowly rotting the wood from the inside. From the outside, it looked fine, solid and strong. But inside, it was breaking down, waiting for just the right amount of pressure to give out. The show started right on time. Silas Godfrey opened with his usual dramatic speech. a mix of wild claims and pseudoscience that audiences of the time loved. First up were the acrobats, performing their most exciting and risky routines to grab everyone's attention from the start. The 6 Polish siblings took to the air, flipping and spinning through their trapeze routine high above the audience. Cheers filled the tent. Everything was running exactly as it had during rehearsals. Next came the lineup of human curiosities. The towering men were introduced first, letting the crowd marvel at their height. Constance Fairchild followed, twisting her body into positions that seemed impossible for a human being. Then came conjoined twins, put on display as part of the show. And finally, the children, each with their own unique traits. Every act was carefully staged, built to pull on emotions while still pretending to be educational. Around 9:45 p.m., the wind started to pick up. At first, it was nothing alarming, just occasional gusts that made the canvas ripple. Tents like this were built to hold up in strong weather. But what was forming outside wasn't ordinary wind. Experts would later call it a microburst, a rare, violent burst of cold air that drops from a storm cloud and slams into ground, sending winds speeding outward at over 90 miles per hour. People nearby, but not inside the tent, said the sky suddenly turned pitch black. Lightning flashed low across the clouds. The air got much colder in just a few minutes. Then the wind hit, not slowly, but all at once, like a wall of force smashing into everything in its path. Inside, the noise grew louder. The tent canvas started shaking harder. Ropes pulled tight and made high-pitched whines. Some performers glanced up instinctively, sensing something was off. Silas Godfrey, trying to keep the crowd calm, kept talking, but a few witnesses said his voice had a nervous edge now. Then the central pole began to groan. It was a deep, barely audible sound, but those near the center could feel it through the floorboards. The inner crack in the mast, made worse by the intense sideways pressure from the storm, started to spread. The wood was breaking apart inside, one fiber at a time, until everything gave way at once. At 10:03 p.m., the mast collapsed. It wasn't a slow break. It snapped with a violent burst, releasing all the tension built up in the ropes and the tent's frame. Pieces of oak flew through the air like missiles. Steel cables, now unanchored, whipped through the tent at deadly speeds. The canvas, soaked with rain and weighing over 2 tons, dropped like a trap, burying everyone beneath it. What happened next is hard to piece together. The only accounts come from physical evidence and a few people outside. No one who was inside survived to describe it. What is known is that the falling wood, snapping cables, and the crushing weight of the tent created a deadly chain reaction. People close to the exits might have had a brief chance to escape, but it vanished quickly. In the total darkness, trapped under wet, heavy canvas and gripped by panic, finding a way out became nearly impossible. The canvas didn't just fall flat. It folded and wrapped itself around people, forming air pockets that quickly ran out of oxygen. Meanwhile, the wind kept slamming into the structure, pulling and twisting it so violently that rescuers couldn't get close. Locals rushed to help, but were met with chaos. The tent had become a huge black mass, flapping wildly in the storm. Screams came from inside, muffled by the canvas and the howling wind. People tried tearing it open, but the weight and shape of the collapsed tent made it impossible. The screams slowly faded, and then stopped completely. The storm lasted about 40 minutes before easing up. Only then could rescuers move in. Clearing the wreckage took hours. Layer by layer, they cut through the wet canvas and broken wood, pulling out bodies from the twisted mess beneath. What they found was horrifying. The final death toll was 317. Every performer, every ticket holder, no one inside the tent made it out alive. People died in different ways. Head injuries from fragments, wounds from whipping cables, being crushed under the structure, or suffocating beneath the canvas. Many victims had multiple fatal injuries, making it hard to say what exactly caused their deaths. The local response was quick for that time period. A coroner arrived the next morning. Police blocked off the area. Telegrams went out to nearby cities for help. But the scale of the disaster was too much for a small town to handle. There weren't enough coffins, no more big enough, not even enough grave diggers to bury so many. In the end, they did what they had to. A nearby field was turned into a temporary cemetery. Large graves were dug. Bodies were wrapped in sheets of materials were available, laid to rest without them when they weren't. Officials tried to record identities, but many of the bodies were damaged beyond recognition. They collected what personal items they could: pocket watches, rings, children's toys, religious keepsakes, small things that once meant everything to someone. Reginald Chamberlain, the coroner who led the official investigation, wrote a 43-page report that's still kept in the National Archives in London. His report was extremely detailed when describing the injuries and explaining how the tent structure failed, but there were strange gaps, parts where the language became vague or intentionally unclear. There was even a secret appendix sealed by court order, locked away from the public for 50 years. Why such secrecy? The reason becomes clearer when looking at side documents, letters, local records, and newspaper reports that were later pulled from circulation. There were parts of this tragedy that officials in Victorian England didn't want widely known. They feared it might cause public unrest or damage social order. First came the question of responsibility. Who could be blamed for the deaths of 317 people? Silas Godfrey was dead, removing the most obvious person to charge. Investigators found that he had hired local laborers to help set up the tent. But those men also died that night. The wooden mast had been bought from a Liverpool supplier, who claimed it was the buyer's job to inspect it. City officials who granted the performance license said their duty only covered paperwork, not construction safety. Everyone passed the blame to someone else. Then there was the issue of who the audience had been. Among the victims were several respected locals, a magistrate and his wife, 2 wealthy merchants, and a reverend son. For people of their social standing, being seen at a freak show was considered shameful in proper Victorian society. Their families didn't want to admit it publicly. Most chose quiet mourning over public acknowledgement. The third and most troubling discovery was evidence that panic itself had made the tragedy worse. Investigators found that many victims weren't only killed by falling debris, but by others desperately trying to escape. Several bodies were found piled near the exits, crushed by the crowd's rush. Children were trampled, the elderly knocked down. In moments of terror, the usual sense of order and civility had collapsed completely, something deeply uncomfortable for society that saw itself as disciplined and morally superior. In his private notes, Chamberlain wrote something that never appeared in his official report. He noticed that several performers seemed to have died trying to protect the audience. The strong man was found covering 3 children, shielding them from falling debris. Constance Fairchild had died bent over an elderly woman, apparently trying to create space so she could breathe. The conjoined twins were discovered among a group of people, their arms outstretched as if trying to hold up part of the tent. These moments of bravery were never made public. They didn't fit the image that Victorian society wanted to maintain, that circus performers and freaks were moral outcasts or curiosities, not heroes. Admitting that those the public had mocked were the ones who showed the most humanity was something the authorities and press preferred to ignore. In the days after the disaster, local newspapers printed short reports. The Manchester Guardian ran just 3 paragraphs. The Liverpool Mercury published 5. Then, just as people began asking questions, the story vanished. Within 2 weeks, coverage stopped completely, not because readers lost interest, but because officials wanted it silenced. There were whispers that continued attention might push for new safety laws for public entertainment, something theaters, music halls, and other circuses didn't want. Wealthy business owners feared tighter regulations would hurt profits. With pressure from above, the story was buried, and most of England quietly moved on. The victims' families received very little help. A charity fund was started, raising small sums through donations. Some families received £5, others 10, roughly 2 to 4 months of wages for a factory worker. It was something, but nowhere near enough to cover the loss of entire families. One acrobat, Percival Davenport, left behind a wife and 4 children in London. She received £7 and 6 shillings from the relief fund. It was enough to get by for about 3 months before she had to send 2 of her children to an orphanage and take a job in a textile mill. Her story wasn't unusual. It was what happened to many working-class families after such tragedies. Constance Fairchild's younger brother, Robert, survived only because he had fallen ill that afternoon and stayed behind an inn. He was 16. He lost his sister, his troupe, his livelihood all at once. Records show that he tried to keep performing on his own, but couldn't make a living. In 1878, his name appeared on a poorhouse list in Birmingham. After 1882, he disappeared from all public records, likely dead, his end unrecorded. The field where the tragedy happened was left abandoned. No one ever rebuilt there. No plaque was put up. For decades, it remained an empty stretch of land, sometimes used for grazing sheep. Quiet and forgotten, local people stayed away from the field, especially at night. Over time, as always happens after a major tragedy, stories began to spread. People claimed to hear voices in the wind, see strange shapes in the fog, notice flickering lights that had no explanation. These were the usual kind of ghost stories people tell when a place carries deep grief. In 1923, nearly 50 years after the disaster, a local businessman made plans to build a warehouse on the land. But while digging the foundations, workers found bones. Lots of them. The mass graves from 1875 had never been properly marked, and years of overgrowth had hidden them completely. Construction stopped immediately. Archaeologists were brought in. The remains were carefully uncovered, cataloged, and moved to a proper cemetery. A small plaque was placed there. It read only, "In memory of those who perished in the Circus tragedy, September 1875. The photo you're looking at was found in 1967, tucked inside a trunk filled with old family papers. It belonged to the descendants of the photographer who had taken it. Alongside it were glass negatives, receipts, and letters, routine materials. No one in the family knew the photo's significance until a local historian, researching Victorian-era entertainment, noticed that names in the photographer's notes matched names of the victims. That's when the truth came to light. This wasn't just a circus photo. It was the last living record of 37 people, taken just 6 hours before they all died. Look closely. Every face, every posture, every look in this image belongs to someone who had no idea their life was about to end. One woman in the second row was set to marry the following week. A tall man near the back had already bought a ticket to emigrate to America. A little boy in front had just started learning how to read. All those plans, all those possibilities, were erased in 40 minutes of wind and chaos. The real story of what happened in 1875 didn't vanish because no one documented it. It was buried on purpose. Victorian society didn't want to face what the tragedy revealed. How fragile their systems were, how shallow their promises of safety and care had been, and how easily some lives were ignored after death. Freak show performers lived in a strange space in Victorian England. They were both famous and looked down on. Crowds came to watch them, to point and stare, but few respected them. When they were alive, they were seen as oddities. When they died, they were treated like problems to be quietly handled. There's a letter from October 1875 in the Home Office archives. A police officer in Manchester wrote to a superior in London about media coverage of the event. He suggested it might be best to discourage further reporting. His words, "The incident, although regrettable, involved primarily individuals of questionable social category. Prolonged attention serves only to disturb public sensibilities." The letter was never sent, but the fact that it was written and saved shows how common that attitude was in official circles. This reveals a harsh truth about the time. A society that prided itself on being advanced, moral, and Christian also ranked people's worth in cold, brutal terms. Those who didn't fit into the ideal were seen as worth less. Their deaths brought fewer questions, less compensation, and no real remembrance. But take another look at the photograph. Don't see oddities or sideshow acts. See people. Real people. See the acrobat who faced their fear of heights every day. See the contortionist who kept performing despite the pain in her joints. See the children who played between shows, had wild imaginations, and dreamed of something bigger. They weren't curiosities. They were full human beings who deserved dignity in life and in death. What happened in that tent wasn't just a collapse of wood and fabric. It was a collapse of basic human decency, a failure to protect, a failure to remember. But by telling their story now, by naming them, by recognizing them for who they were, we take a small step toward making things right. We bring light back to a history that was pushed into the dark. When the storm passed that September night and silence fell over the wreckage, something had changed. Not in government rules or social norms. Those stayed the same for decades. But in the hearts of the people who lived nearby, who heard the screams, who helped dig the graves, those who knew without doubt that what had fallen wasn't just a tent. It was the illusion of control, of order, of moral superiority. And underneath it were real lives, crushed not just by the storm, but by a system that didn't see their worth. If this story stirred something in you, if it made you question how society decides whose lives matter and whose don't, hold on to that feeling. It means your conscience is working. And if you like to keep exploring these hidden stories from the Victorian era, the people history tried to erase, stick around. There are more photographs, more lives, waiting to be remembered. Some memories won't stay buried forever.